They say a mirror never lies. As I adjusted my tie in the mirror of our Chicago apartment, I couldn't help but notice how calm I looked. Calm on the outside, anyway. Inside, it felt like someone had set fire to everything I thought I knew. I smoothed down my shirt, giving myself one last once-over. I had always prided myself on my patience, a trait that had carried me through difficult clients, sleepless nights with our son Noah, and now this. The discovery that my wife Laura was living a life I hadn't signed up for. It started innocently enough, or so I told myself. A small change here, a curious behavior there. I'd noticed Laura had stopped wearing her wedding ring a few weeks ago. "It's too tight," she had said with a shrug, as if a simple resizing was beyond her. At the time, I wanted to believe her, but the explanation didn't sit right. That ring wasn't just metal. It was a symbol of promises we'd made. So why was she suddenly so eager to leave it in a drawer? The answer came faster than I was ready for. Late one night, after Noah had gone to bed, I sat alone in my office. The glow of my laptop lit up the dark room as I sifted through data collected by the surveillance software I'd reluctantly installed on Laura's devices. I know it sounds extreme, but when the knots in your gut scream that something's wrong, you either ignore them or find out why they're there. And there it was. Mark Delaney, 29 years old, fresh out of business school and practically a golden boy at Laura's company. The messages between them weren't just casual chats about office deadlines or team lunches. They were personal, emotional. It was all there. Inside jokes I'd never heard, compliments about her laugh, plans for private coffee breaks. And then there were the pictures. Nothing risque, just candid shots of the two of them at work events. His arm a little too close to her shoulder, her smile a little too bright for comfort. My hands tightened on the edge of the desk as I stared at them. It wasn't just about infidelity. It was about trust, years of it, being chipped away one message at a time. But what hit me hardest wasn't the messages or even the pictures. It was Noah. Noah, our 12-year-old son, had been struggling lately. A science project he'd been excited about had turned into a disaster when Laura forgot to help him. She'd promised to guide him, but when the time came, she was busy. I remembered the look on his face that evening. Confusion mixed with disappointment. He had asked me why Mom didn't care about his project, and I had no answer. I'd made sacrifices for this family. I'd left a high-powered career in corporate consulting to start my own business so I could work from home and be present for Noah. I structured my days around his schedule, driving him to soccer practice, helping with homework, and making sure he always had a safe place to land. Meanwhile, Laura had climbed the corporate ladder, a path I supported, even if it sometimes felt like she was sprinting ahead, leaving us behind. I let out a slow breath, forcing the frustration to the back of my mind. Tonight wasn't the night to let my emotions get the better of me. Instead of letting Laura's betrayal consume me, I had spent the last few weeks preparing. Quietly, methodically, I built connections with Margaret Hawthorne, the founder of Laura's company, a sharp but kind woman who valued family and integrity. She and I had struck up a friendship over shared values and parenting stories during corporate events. She liked me, respected me, and I had a similar rapport with Caleb Preston, one of the key board members who had been a mentor of sorts during my brief stint advising Laura's company. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Laura was cozying up to Mark, I had quietly aligned myself with two of the most influential people in her professional world. If she thought I was going to confront her with nothing but anger and accusations, she had another thing coming. This wasn't just about exposing her actions, it was about reshaping our future. Still, as I stood there in front of the mirror, the weight of what I was about to do pressed heavily on my shoulders. My plan wasn't driven by revenge. It wasn't even about punishing Laura, as tempting as that might seem. It was about showing her that her choices had consequences, not just for her but for me and, most importantly, for Noah. The sound of the door opening snapped me out of my thoughts. Laura's voice echoed through the apartment, casual and cheerful, as if it were just another evening. "Ethan?" she called. "You home?" I took a deep breath, straightened my tie, and stepped out of the bedroom. "Yeah," I replied, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud, and for a moment, Her expression flickered with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Guilt? Before she could respond, I added, "Let's sit down. It's important." Her hesitation was brief, but it was there. She followed me to the living room, where I gestured for her to take a seat. As I sat down across from her, I felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. But this wasn't the confrontation she might have been expecting. This was just the beginning, and she had no idea what was coming next. The restaurant smelled of polished wood and aged wine, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the gentle clink of glasses. Carlton's was the kind of place where power plays happened over perfectly seared steaks and vintage Cabernet, a fitting stage for what I had planned. I stepped into the private alcove where Caleb Preston and Vivian Harper were already seated, their presence an unspoken reminder that this wasn't just about me. Caleb was as composed as ever, the kind of man whose quiet authority made everyone take notice. He gave me a nod as I approached, his calm demeanor putting me at ease. Vivian, on the other hand, radiated energy. A venture capitalist with a reputation for zero tolerance when it came to unethical behavior, she offered me a firm handshake and a knowing smile. "You ready?" Vivian asked, her sharp eyes studying me. I straightened my tie and forced a small smile. "More than ready." As I took my seat, a waiter approached with menus, but Caleb waved him off. "Not yet," he said smoothly, his attention focused on me. "We're waiting for two more." It wasn't long before I spotted Laura and Mark walking into the restaurant. She was all business tonight, wearing a sleek black dress that exuded confidence, her hair pulled back in a polished bun. Mark trailed slightly behind her, his suit tailored but his steps uncertain. They hadn't noticed us yet, and for a moment, I watched them from a distance, wondering if they had any idea of the storm waiting for them. When their eyes finally landed on our table, I saw it, the briefest flicker of hesitation in Laura's expression. Caleb and Vivian were not names you wanted to see on the other side of a dinner meeting unless you were ready to defend your actions. Mark, on the other hand, froze entirely, his confidence slipping away as quickly as it had arrived. Laura's smile was polite, almost brittle, as they reached the table. "Ethan," she said, her tone carefully controlled. "This is unexpected." "Laura," I replied evenly. "Mark, please sit." She glanced at Caleb and Vivian, who offered polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes, and I saw her piece together that this wasn't a casual dinner. Mark hesitated before lowering himself into the chair beside Laura, his discomfort palpable. The moment they were seated, the air shifted. "I think we can skip the pleasantries," Caleb said, his voice smooth but firm. "Ethan has something he'd like to discuss, and Vivian and I thought it best to address it here." Laura's confidence wavered, but she covered it well. "I'm not sure what this is about," she said, her tone edging toward defensive. "You will soon," I replied, keeping my voice calm. I slid a slim folder across the table toward her, watching as her eyes flickered with uncertainty. "What's this?" she asked, hesitating before opening it. I leaned back in my chair. "Documentation." She opened the folder, her expression hardening as she scanned the pages. Expense reports, financial statements, and, most damning of all, screenshots of her conversations with Mark. I'd highlighted specific messages, complete with timestamps that aligned with company records showing questionable charges. Her hand hovered over the folder, frozen, as if closing it would somehow make the contents disappear. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice tight. Vivian spoke next, her tone sharp and unforgiving. "What's ridiculous, Laura, is the misuse of company funds to support personal activities. I'm particularly interested in these receipts for after-hours meetings." "I can explain," Laura started, but her voice faltered as Vivian raised an eyebrow. "I hope so," Vivian said, "because the board is going to have questions." Mark, who had been silent until now, finally found his voice. "This feels like an ambush," he said, his tone unsteady. "That's because it is," Caleb replied smoothly, folding his hands on the table. "Mark, you're a promising young professional, but this behavior? It's not what we expect from someone in your position." Mark flushed, his discomfort growing by the second. He shifted in his seat, looking to Laura for support, but she was too busy scrambling to address Vivian's accusations. "This is all being blown out of proportion," Laura insisted, her voice growing sharper. I leaned forward, keeping my tone steady. "Blown out of proportion? You've been siphoning company funds for personal use and compromising the integrity of your position with extracurricular activities." I let the words hang in the air, giving her no room to interrupt. She glared at me, her composure cracking. "I can't believe you would stoop to this level." I met her gaze, unflinching. "Stoop to what?" "To uncovering the truth." Mark shifted uncomfortably again, his confidence completely eroded. He looked like a child caught stealing cookies from the jar, his earlier swagger nowhere to be found. Vivian didn't let up. "Laura, these financial discrepancies reflect poorly on you and the company. If this continues, we'll have to escalate the matter to the full board." Laura's face was pale now, her forced confidence replaced by the weight of realization. She wasn't in control of the narrative anymore. I'll fix this," she stammered. "Whatever's wrong, I'll make it right." Vivian raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "That remains to be seen." The table fell into silence, the weight of the confrontation settling over us like a thick fog. I watched Laura, waiting for her to fully grasp the magnitude of what she'd done. Not just to the company, but to me, to Noah, to everything we'd built together. Mark finally cleared his throat, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I should go." "Smart choice," Caleb said without looking at him. Mark stood, his shoulders hunched as he muttered something to Laura before scurrying out of the restaurant. I watched him leave, knowing this was just the beginning of the fallout. Laura remained seated, her hands trembling slightly as she closed the folder and pushed it aside. For the first time, she seemed to understand that this wasn't just a private matter anymore. I stood, straightening my jacket. "Laura, this isn't about ruining you. It's about accountability. You've made choices with consequences." She didn't respond, her gaze fixed on the folder in front of her. "This is your opportunity to take responsibility," I added, my voice steady. "For your sake and for Noah's." I turned to Caleb and Vivian, nodding my thanks before leaving the table. I didn't look back as I walked out of the restaurant, but I could feel Laura's gaze on me, the weight of everything she'd lost finally sinking in. And this was only the beginning. Walking into Avalon Enterprises that morning felt surreal. The bustling lobby was a sea of activity. Executives on phone calls, employees hurrying to meetings. But there was an undercurrent of tension, like the air before a thunderstorm. Today wasn't just another day at work. Today, everything was about to change. I adjusted my tie and headed to the elevator, ignoring the curious glances from people who must have sensed something was up. The weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me, but I stayed focused. Margaret Hawthorne's words from our last meeting echoed in my mind. The company needs leadership it can trust. This isn't just about Laura. It's about the future of Avalon. The emergency board meeting had been scheduled for 9 a.m. sharp. By the time I stepped into the conference room, most of the board members were already seated, their expressions ranging from curious to grim. Margaret sat at the head of the table, her sharp gaze scanning the room like a general surveying a battlefield. Caleb Preston sat to her right, reviewing documents with a calm intensity, while Vivian Harper, ever the powerhouse, whispered something to a colleague. Laura walked in moments later, her confidence visibly strained. She still wore the polished facade of a CEO, but the cracks were beginning to show. Her expression was tight, her movements calculated, as if she could will her authority back into existence. She nodded to a few board members, her smile brittle, before taking her seat. I waited for Margaret to call the meeting to order, letting the anticipation build. Finally, she cleared her throat, commanding the room's attention. This emergency session has been called to address serious concerns regarding the financial and operational oversight of Avalon Enterprises. Margaret began, her voice steady and authoritative. Ethan Benson has requested the opportunity to present his findings. Ethan, the floor is yours. I stood, my hand steady as I placed a thick binder on the table. Thank you, Margaret. Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time this morning. What I'm about to share concerns not just Avalon's financial health, but the integrity of its leadership. I opened the binder, revealing the meticulously organized evidence I'd compiled over weeks. Expense reports, transaction histories, and email logs were all laid out in painstaking detail. I handed copies to each board member, watching as they flipped through the pages. For months, Avalon has been experiencing financial inconsistencies. I began. Discrepancies in expense accounts, unauthorized budget reallocations, and questionable charges, all of which trace back to decisions made under Laura's leadership. Laura straightened in her seat, her composure visibly faltering. "This is ridiculous," she interjected. "If there were issues, I would have been informed." "Were you informed about these?" I asked, sliding a page across the table. It was an expense report tied to a series of meetings with no supporting documentation. She glanced at the page, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Those were client meetings." "Client meetings with no clients present?" I countered. "And yet, the charges include luxury dining, transportation, and lodging. When cross-referenced with internal schedules, these meetings align with personal trips." The room was silent, the weight of my words sinking in. Vivian leaned forward, her voice cold and precise. "Laura, this isn't just about poor judgment. It's about a pattern of behavior that puts the company at risk. Shareholders expect transparency and accountability. Right now, Avalon has neither." Laura turned to Caleb, as if hoping for an ally. But Caleb simply shook his head. "We've reviewed the evidence, Laura. This goes beyond minor mistakes." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. "Ethan, continue." I took a deep breath and moved on to the next section. The improper relationship with Mark Delaney. I had debated whether to include this, but it was crucial to the bigger picture. "Finally," I said, "there's the issue of professional conduct. Laura's close relationship with a subordinate, Mark Delaney, has raised concerns about favoritism and misuse of resources." Laura's face turned pale. "This is a personal attack," she said, her voice shaking. "You're crossing the line, Ethan." "This isn't personal," I replied, my tone steady. "It's about ensuring Avalon is led by someone who prioritizes the company's success over their own interests." The tension in the room was palpable as I presented the last piece of evidence. Messages between Laura and Mark discussing their plans to use company funds for client engagement. The board members exchanged glances, the weight of the situation sinking in. Margaret finally broke the silence. "We've heard enough." Laura looked around the room, her desperation mounting. "You can't be serious. You're all going to take his word over mine." "This isn't about taking sides," Margaret said firmly. "It's about protecting Avalon. We need leadership we can trust." A vote was called, and one by one, the board members cast their decisions. The result was unanimous. Laura was to be removed as CEO, effective immediately. The room fell silent as the verdict settled. Laura sat frozen, disbelief etched into her features. For a moment, she seemed ready to argue, but the futility of the situation was clear. Margaret turned to me. "Ethan, we'd like you to step in as interim CEO while we restructure the leadership team. Your experience and integrity make you the right person to guide Avalon through this transition." I nodded, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll do everything I can to ensure Avalon's success." Laura stood abruptly, gathering her things. She didn't look at me as she walked out of the room, her heels clicking against the polished floor. As the door closed behind her, Margaret addressed the board. "Now let's discuss next steps. We have work to do." Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the role of interim CEO. It wasn't just about damage control, it was about revitalizing Avalon. I focused on fostering a culture of transparency, collaboration, and innovation. Caleb and Vivian became key allies, helping me implement changes that reflected the company's core values. There were long nights and tough decisions, but every step felt like a move in the right direction. Avalon wasn't just recovering, it was thriving. And Laura? She was no longer part of the picture. But her absence wasn't the relief I had expected. It was a reminder of everything I'd lost, of the family we'd been, and of the life I was now rebuilding on my own terms. This wasn't just about the company. It was about my future. And I wasn't done yet. If the boardroom had been a battlefield, then the courtroom was a proving ground where emotions were laid bare and the stakes felt impossibly high. This wasn't about strategy or corporate maneuvering. This was about Noah, about protecting him from the fallout of everything that had gone wrong. The day of the hearing arrived with the kind of cold, gray skies that seemed fitting for what lay ahead. I straightened my tie in the reflection of the courthouse windows, thinking about how much had led up to this moment. Beside me, Naomi Sinclair, my lawyer, adjusted her notes with the precision of someone who had done this 100 times. "Ethan, we've got this," Naomi said, her voice calm but firm. She was sharp and unyielding, the kind of advocate you wanted in your corner. "Just stick to the facts. Let the evidence speak for itself." I nodded, though my chest felt heavy. Noah's future was on the line, and I couldn't afford to falter. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people shuffled into their seats. Laura sat at the opposite table, her posture stiff and her expression carefully neutral. I noticed how she avoided looking my way, her focus trained on her attorney. The proceedings began, and Naomi wasted no time presenting our case. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this case is about providing a stable, nurturing environment for Noah Benson, a young boy who has already been deeply affected by his parents' separation." She outlined the evidence methodically. Laura's frequent absences, her missed commitments, and her prioritization of work over family. Text messages and emails corroborated a pattern of neglect, while calendar records showed how many milestones she had missed over the past year. Then came the hardest part, Noah's testimony. When he walked into the courtroom, my heart ached. He looked so small, standing there in his button-down shirt and dress shoes, his hands clasped nervously in front of him. The judge spoke kindly to him, explaining the process in a way that felt almost reassuring. "Noah," the judge said, "you're here to share what you feel is important about your family. Take your time and speak from your heart." Noah nodded, his voice quiet but steady as he began. He talked about how I helped him with his science projects, how we read together every night, and how I always made time for his soccer games. Then he spoke about Laura, how often she was too busy, or how she promised to be there but never showed up. "There was this one time," Noah said, looking down at his hands. "She said she'd help me build a rocket for school. I waited all weekend, but she never did. Dad helped me instead." I felt a lump in my throat as I listened. This wasn't just about winning custody. It was about giving Noah the stability and love he deserved. Laura's lawyer tried to downplay the testimony, painting her as a hard-working mother doing her best under difficult circumstances. But the cracks in her narrative were clear. The evidence of her neglect was too strong to ignore, and her absence from key moments in Noah's life couldn't be explained away. When it was time for closing arguments, Naomi's voice rang out with conviction. "Noah deserves a parent who is present," she said, her gaze sweeping the courtroom. "Ethan Benson has demonstrated unwavering dedication to his son's well-being, providing not just emotional support, but a stable and loving home. This case is not about punishing anyone. It's about doing what's best for Noah." The judge deliberated for what felt like an eternity. When he finally delivered his decision, every word felt like a weight lifting off my chest. "Given the evidence presented," the judge said, "it is in Noah Benson's best interest to award primary custody to his father, Ethan Benson. Mrs. Laura Benson will have supervised visitation to ensure Noah's emotional and physical well-being." Laura's face crumpled for a brief moment before she regained her composure. As much as I felt relief, there was no satisfaction in seeing her pain. This wasn't about winning, it was about doing right by Noah. Outside the courthouse, I knelt down to Noah's level, pulling him into a hug. "We're going to be okay, buddy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. He nodded, holding on tightly. "I know, Dad." From that day forward, everything I did was for him. I shifted my schedule to ensure I was home when he needed me. I helped him with his school projects, nurtured his growing interest in science, and made sure he never doubted how much he was loved. One evening, we sat in the living room assembling a model of the solar system. Noah held up a tiny plastic Saturn, his eyes lighting up as he explained the planet's rings. "Did you know Saturn's rings are made of ice and rock?" he asked. "I didn't," I replied, smiling. "You're teaching me something new." For the first time in months, I saw him truly relax, his joy unclouded by worry. Meanwhile, Laura struggled to adapt to her new reality. Her diminished role at Avalon Enterprises had left her directionless, and the limits on her time with Noah only added to her frustrations. The confident, polished woman I had once known seemed to vanish, replaced by someone grappling with the consequences of her actions. During her supervised visits, I watched her try to reconnect with Noah, but the gap between them was undeniable. Noah was polite but distant, his trust in her fractured. It wasn't something I took pleasure in, but it was a reminder of how much work she had to do to rebuild what she had broken. As weeks turned into months, our home settled into a new rhythm. Noah thrived under the stability and structure I worked hard to provide, and I found a renewed sense of purpose in being the father he needed. One evening, as we wrapped up another science project, Noah looked at me and said, "Dad, I think you're my favorite scientist." I laughed, ruffling his hair. "I think you're mine too." For the first time in a long while, our future felt steady, and I wasn't going to let anything take that away. The day I stepped into Avalon Enterprises as interim CEO, the office felt different. There was a quiet undercurrent of hope that hadn't been there before. People were still reeling from the upheaval. Laura's removal had left its mark, but there was something else in the air: possibility. I stood in the center of the open office, observing the buzz of activity. People nodded as I passed, some offering tentative smiles. They weren't used to seeing me in this role, but that was about to change. "Morning, Ethan," Emily Carter said as she walked by, her arms full of blueprints. Emily was one of Avalon's most brilliant engineers, her work a cornerstone of the company's R&D department. Under Laura's leadership, she'd been overlooked, her ideas buried under projects aimed at short-term profit. I knew that had to change. "Emily," I said, stopping her in her tracks. "Got a minute?" She blinked in surprise, then adjusted the blueprints in her arms. "Of course. What's up?" I gestured toward a nearby conference room. "Let's talk." Inside, I got straight to the point. "I've been reviewing your work, Emily. The solar-powered microgrid design you proposed last year. It's exceptional." Her eyes widened. "You've seen that?" "It never made it past the planning stage. Laura thought it was too ambitious." "That's exactly why we need it now," I said. "We're shifting our focus toward long-term, sustainable innovation, and I want you to lead that charge." Emily stared at me, her surprise quickly giving way to a determined smile. "I won't let you down, Ethan." "I know you won't," I replied. Promoting Emily to a senior role in R&D was the first of many steps I took to revitalize Avalon. For too long, the company had prioritized short-term gains over meaningful innovation, chasing quarterly profits at the expense of its identity. That wasn't going to happen on my watch. I reallocated resources to projects that had been shelved: energy-efficient technologies, advanced robotics, and cutting-edge medical devices. These were the kinds of initiatives that had once made Avalon a leader in its field, and it was time to reclaim that legacy. The employees responded with enthusiasm. For the first time in years, there was a sense of purpose driving their work. Teams collaborated with renewed energy, brainstorming ideas and pushing boundaries. I held weekly meetings with department heads, not just to track progress but to ensure their voices were heard. But it wasn't just about what we built, it was about the people we empowered. One afternoon, I stood in a conference room with Margaret Hawthorne and Caleb Preston, reviewing the plans for Avalon's future. "We need to think beyond the company," I said, pacing in front of the whiteboard. "If we're going to lead the industry, we have to invest in the next generation." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "What do you have in mind?" That's when I introduced the idea for the Isabel Ramirez Foundation for Youth Technology. Named after one of Avalon's first engineers, the foundation would focus on inspiring young minds to pursue careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. We'll offer scholarships, mentorship programs, and hands-on workshops, I explained. It's about giving kids the tools to dream big and the means to make those dreams a reality. Caleb smiled, leaning back in his chair. It's ambitious, but it's exactly what Avalon needs to set itself apart. The foundation launched 3 months later, and its impact was immediate. Schools from across the region partnered with Avalon to host events, and students flocked to the workshops. Seeing their excitement reminded me of why I had fought so hard to take on this role. Noah was one of the first participants. "Dad, check this out," he said one evening, holding up a small robot he'd built during a foundation workshop. Its tiny arms whirred as it rolled across the kitchen table, knocking over a salt shaker in its path. "That's incredible, buddy," I said, laughing as I set the salt shaker upright. "You really built that?" "Yeah. And next week, we're going to learn how to program it to follow commands." His eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a moment, I saw the future he could have. A future where his creativity and intelligence were nurtured. The foundation quickly gained recognition, earning praise from educators, industry leaders, and even local media. Noah excelled in the program, winning awards for his ingenuity in robotics and making connections with mentors who saw his potential. At Avalon, the changes were just as profound. Employee morale soared as they saw their work contributing to meaningful projects. Investors, once wary of the company's direction, began to take notice of our renewed focus on integrity and innovation. During an investor meeting, one of our longtime stakeholders approached me. "Ethan," he said, extending his hand, "I've been with Avalon for over a decade, and I have to say, I haven't seen this kind of energy here in years." "That means a lot," I replied, shaking his hand. "You're proving that doing the right thing and running a successful business aren't mutually exclusive," he added. That comment stayed with me. It reinforced what I had always believed. Success wasn't just about numbers on a balance sheet. It was about people, about creating something that left the world better than you found it. As Avalon's reputation grew, so did its influence. We became a leader not just in technology but in corporate responsibility, setting a standard that others began to emulate. And through it all, I kept my focus on what mattered most. Noah. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Noah turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think I could work at Avalon someday?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "You can do anything you set your mind to, Noah. And when the time comes, I'll be there to help you every step of the way." Rebuilding Avalon had been a journey, one filled with challenges, sacrifices, and moments of doubt. But as I looked at my son, his future bright with possibility, I knew it had been worth every step. This wasn't just the story of a company's comeback. It was the story of a new beginning for Avalon, for Noah, and for me. The last time I saw Laura in person, she had left Avalon's headquarters in stunned silence, clutching a folder of evidence that had systematically dismantled the life she had built. That image stayed with me, her once confident stride reduced to slow, faltering steps. But I didn't dwell on it. I had my own life to rebuild, and my focus was on Noah, Avalon, and moving forward. Months later, news of her had reached me in bits and pieces, like faint echoes from a life I no longer recognized as mine. She had moved to Milwaukee, a city far enough from Chicago to ensure she wouldn't run into former colleagues or friends. It wasn't a triumphant relocation. It was an escape. She had taken a middle management job at a regional logistics firm, a position far beneath her former title as CEO of Avalon Enterprises. The move was humbling, no doubt, but also inevitable. Her name, once associated with success and ambition, was now tainted. Ethan Benson's evidence of her financial misconduct had left an indelible mark, and even if her missteps didn't make front-page news, they had spread just enough through professional circles to block her path back to the top. I learned about her modest apartment from a mutual acquaintance, a 2-bedroom unit in a quiet complex that catered to mid-level professionals. It was a stark contrast to the luxurious home we had once shared, filled with light and space and the laughter of a family that no longer existed. Her attempts to claw her way back into prominence didn't go unnoticed. I heard from Margaret Hawthorne that Laura had sent out resumes to various firms, trying to secure consulting contracts and leadership roles. But the weight of her past followed her. None of the high-profile companies wanted to take a chance on someone with her history. "You were thorough, Ethan," Margaret said during one of our weekly check-ins. "It's hard to come back from what she did. Not just to the company, but to you and Noah." I nodded, though Margaret's words didn't fill me with satisfaction. Laura had made her choices, and while I wasn't responsible for her downfall, I couldn't deny the part one played in exposing it. Meanwhile, Mark Delaney's own fall from grace had been just as swift. When his unprofessional relationship with Laura became public knowledge, he was quietly let go from Avalon. At first, he tried to frame himself as a victim of corporate politics, but his attempts to shift blame fell flat. I heard he'd struggled to find stable work, bouncing between freelance gigs and short-term contracts that never quite stuck. His golden boy reputation had tarnished quickly, leaving him in the same professional purgatory as Laura. Despite their mutual ruin, Laura and Mark didn't stay connected. Their partnership, which had once seemed so airtight, unraveled under the pressure of their shared disgrace. I suppose it was easier for them to blame each other than to take responsibility for their actions. As for me, I stayed focused on Avalon and Noah. The company was thriving, its reputation for innovation and integrity drawing in new investors and partnerships. I spent my days building relationships with industry leaders and fostering a culture of collaboration that made Avalon the kind of place where people wanted to work. Noah, meanwhile, was flourishing. His involvement with the Isabel Ramirez Foundation had sparked a deep passion for robotics, and he threw himself into projects with the kind of enthusiasm that reminded me why I'd fought so hard for custody. One evening, as we were working on a robotics project together, Noah asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. "Do you think Mom's okay?" he said, his voice hesitant. I paused, setting down the small screwdriver I'd been using. "Why do you ask?" I don't know. She seems sad when I see her," he said, glancing down at the table. Laura's supervised visits had been strained at best. While she made an effort to engage with Noah, the bond between them had frayed. He hadn't forgotten the missed milestones or broken promises, and while he was polite, there was a distance that hadn't been there before. "I'm sure she's doing the best she can," I said carefully, "but you don't need to worry about that. You just focus on being the amazing person you are." He nodded, though the question lingered in his eyes. Laura tried to reach out to me several times, sending emails and leaving voicemails that went unanswered. Her tone shifted with each attempt, at first defiant, then apologetic, and finally desperate. But I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. One email stood out, though. She had written late one night, and her words were uncharacteristically raw. "I know I messed up," she wrote. "I can't undo the damage I've caused, but I want you to know I regret it. I regret all of it." Regret was a heavy word, one that carried the weight of choices made and paths not taken. But regret alone couldn't rebuild what she had broken. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on the life I was building for myself and for Noah. A life where honesty, hard work, and integrity were the foundation. Laura's dissent was a reminder that actions have consequences, and while I didn't revel in her struggles, I couldn't deny the clarity they brought. She had been given every opportunity to succeed, to be a partner and a parent, and she had chosen a different path. That path had led her to Milwaukee, to a modest apartment and a diminished role in a world she no longer controlled. It was a stark contrast to the life she had once envisioned for herself, but it was the life she had created through her decisions. As for me, I had no intention of looking back. My future was here, with Noah, with Avalon, and with the promise of a life built on trust and purpose. The skyline of Chicago stretched out before me, a testament to resilience and transformation. Standing at the top floor of Avalon's headquarters, I gazed out at the city that had witnessed the highs and lows of my life. 5 years ago, this view had felt different, shrouded in uncertainty, burdened by a life in flux. But today it was a reminder of how far I'd come. Avalon Enterprises was no longer the company it had once been. Under my leadership, we had pivoted toward industries that didn't just define the present but shape the future. Quantum computing, renewable energy, and advanced robotics. These were the fields that Emily Carter and her team had revolutionized. Her promotion years ago had been a turning point, and her innovations had proven not only profitable but transformative. Emily's latest design is incredible, Caleb Preston said, joining me by the window. He held a tablet displaying the prototype of a quantum-powered grid system, a project poised to disrupt the energy sector. She's brilliant, I replied. It's her vision, her leadership that made this possible. And yours, Caleb added. Don't downplay your role in all this, Ethan. You built the foundation that allowed her to thrive. I nodded, though I rarely dwelled on the credit. For me, Avalon's success wasn't about individual recognition. It was about the collective effort of people who believed in something bigger than themselves. One of those people was Noah. At 17, Noah had grown into a thoughtful, determined young man. His natural curiosity and love for learning had flourished, thanks in part to his involvement with the Isabel Ramirez Foundation. He'd participated in nearly every program the foundation offered, from coding workshops to robotics competitions. The foundation had become one of my proudest achievements. Beyond providing scholarships, it offered mentorships and internships, leveling the playing field for underprivileged students who might not have otherwise had access to cutting-edge technology. That afternoon, Noah stopped by my office, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He had come straight from school, his face lit with excitement. "Dad, you've got to see this," he said, pulling out a sleek prototype. It was a portable solar panel he had designed for a school project, compact enough to fit in a backpack but powerful enough to charge multiple devices. "This is incredible," I said, examining the design. "How'd you come up with it?" We were studying renewable energy in my AP Science class, and I thought, why not make something people could actually use every day? Pride swelled in my chest. "You're ahead of the curve, Noah. This is the kind of innovation the world needs." He beamed, and I saw in his eyes a reflection of the future, one built on creativity, integrity, and purpose. Later that evening, I stood before a packed auditorium at Avalon's annual Innovation Summit. Employees, investors, and partners had gathered to celebrate the company's achievements and unveil our next big venture. As I stepped onto the stage, the room erupted into applause. "Thank you," I began, my voice steady but filled with emotion. 5 years ago, Avalon Enterprises was at a crossroads. We faced challenges that tested our values and our resolve. But through those challenges, we found our true purpose: to create technology that not only drives progress but improves lives. I paused, letting my words sink in. Today, Avalon is a leader in quantum computing, renewable energy, and robotics. But our greatest success isn't in the technologies we've developed. It's in the culture we've built. A culture of collaboration, integrity, and innovation. The applause that followed was thunderous, a wave of affirmation that reminded me why I had fought so hard to rebuild this company. After the event, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, I spotted Margaret Hawthorne. She was speaking with a group of young engineers, her presence as commanding as ever. When she noticed me, she excused herself and walked over, a glass of champagne in hand. "You've done well, Ethan," she said, raising her glass. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything," I replied. She smiled, a rare warmth in her expression. "You've earned it." As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. Laura's name rarely came up anymore, and when it did, it was little more than a footnote, a reminder of a chapter that had long since closed. She had chosen a path that led her away from everything we had built together, and while I didn't dwell on her choices, I couldn't deny the clarity they had brought me. My triumph wasn't in her downfall. It was in the life I had created for myself and Noah, a life built on hard work, resilience, and a commitment to doing what was right. As I left the auditorium that night, Noah walked beside me, his solar panel prototype tucked under his arm. "Dad," he said, looking up at me, "do you think I could work at Avalon someday?" I smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. I think you'll do more than that, Noah. I think you'll lead it. The night sky stretched out above us, clear and full of promise. And as we walked to the car, I realized something. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the beginning of a new era. One defined not by what we had overcome but by what we were building together. The sound of applause echoed through the lecture hall as the keynote speaker concluded his presentation. I sat quietly in the audience, watching a young innovator on stage talk about her groundbreaking work in renewable energy, a field she had first explored through the Isabel Ramirez Foundation. Her journey from a modest school in Detroit to being a leader in her field was a story of resilience, passion, and opportunity. As she stepped off the stage, the moderator turned to the audience. And now, let's hear from the man whose vision made it all possible, Mr. Ethan Benson. I took a deep breath, stood, and walked to the podium. It was a familiar scene, yet it carried the same weight it always did. This wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had been part of this journey. Thank you, I began, scanning the faces in the crowd. When we started the Isabel Ramirez Foundation, our goal was simple: to create opportunities for young minds to dream big and to give them the tools to turn those dreams into reality. What we've achieved together is proof that when you invest in people, you invest in the future. The applause that followed was heartfelt, and as I stepped off the stage, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. The foundation had grown far beyond my initial vision. Scholarships, mentorship programs, and international partnerships had created pathways for thousands of students, many of whom had gone on to make their mark in fields ranging from AI to space exploration. Each success story felt like a small victory, a reminder of why I had poured so much of myself into this work. But the greatest victory of all stood waiting for me at the edge of the crowd. Noah. At 22, Noah was no longer the little boy who had once struggled with a science project. He had grown into a confident, driven young man, his future as bright as the innovations he now dreamed of creating. "Great speech, Dad," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. "Thanks, kid," I replied, smiling. "Enjoying the event?" "Yeah, but I can't stop thinking about the lab at MIT. There's so much I want to try when I get there." His excitement was palpable, and it filled me with pride. Noah had earned a spot at MIT, and he was already planning projects that combined his passion for robotics and sustainability. His acceptance letter had been one of the proudest moments of my life, not just because of what it meant for him, but because it represented everything we had worked for: stability, opportunity, and a future built on integrity. "You'll do great things," I said. "Just remember to enjoy the journey." He nodded, his smile widening. "I learned that from you." That evening, as we walked back to our hotel, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. My life had not followed the path I once imagined, but it had led me somewhere even better. Laura's name had all but disappeared from public discourse. Her final attempts to reach out to me met with silence. I hadn't ignored her out of spite. It was simply that our lives had moved in different directions. Regret is a heavy burden, and while I hoped she had found some peace, I knew that her journey was no longer part of mine. One of her last messages had read, "I see everything you've accomplished, and I'm proud of you, even if I can't be part of it." I hadn't responded. There was nothing more to say. Avalon Enterprises, meanwhile, had become a cornerstone of the tech industry, its breakthroughs in quantum computing and renewable energy making headlines around the world. The culture we had built, a culture of trust, innovation, and collaboration, was often cited in business case studies as a model for ethical leadership. At one point, a prominent business journal published a feature titled "The Benson Effect: How Integrity Transformed Avalon and the Industry." The article delved into the strategies that had driven Avalon's success, but more than that, it focused on the values that had guided my leadership: patience, resilience, and a commitment to doing what was right. The recognition was humbling, but it wasn't what defined my legacy. My true legacy was the lives I had touched, the young engineers who had found their calling through the Isabel Ramirez Foundation, the employees at Avalon who had rediscovered their passion, and most of all, Noah. One quiet evening, after the Foundation's annual gala, I found myself sitting on the porch of our home, watching the stars. Noah joined me, his laptop in hand as he tinkered with a design for a new robotics project. "Do you ever think about where we started?" he asked, glancing at me. "All the time," I said. "It reminds me how important it is to keep moving forward." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm glad we did." As I sat there, the weight of the past felt lighter than ever. The pain, the challenges, the moments of doubt. They had all been part of a story that had led to this. A life filled with purpose, love, and the promise of a brighter future. Legacy isn't about the accolades or the titles. It's about the impact you leave behind, the people you lift up, the lives you change, and the example you set for those who come after you. And as I looked at Noah, I knew that my legacy was in good hands.